Welcome back to Bible Study with Tad Unoy. We're at Genesis chapter 45. So welcome back to Whole Bible Study with Tad Unoy. I'm truly glad you're here today. We've been walking through one of the most moving parts of the book of Genesis. It's the story of Joseph and his brothers. Up to this point, Joseph, who had been betrayed and sold into slavery, has risen to power in Egypt. Without revealing who he is, he's been testing his brothers during their visits to buy food in the midst of a famine. Emotions have been building, their past choices are weighing heavily, and today's chapter brings us to the powerful moment in this story. Let's read Genesis 45 together. Genesis 45, we're reading from the NIV version. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, Have anyone leave my presence? So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and the Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, Come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there's been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save our lives by great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler of all of Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen, and be near me, you and your children and your grandchildren, your flocks and your herds, and all you have. I will provide for you. I will provide for you there, because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all you belong to you will become destitute. You can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that it really is I who am speaking to you. Tell my father about all who honor accorded me in Egypt, and about everything you have seen, and bring my father down here quickly. He then threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept, and Benjamin embraced him weeping. And he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Afterwards, his brothers talked with him. Then the news reached Pharaoh's palace that Joseph's brothers had come. Pharaoh and all his officials were pleased. Pharaoh said to Joseph, Tell your brothers, do this, load your animals and return to the land of Canaan, and bring your father and your families back to me. I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you can enjoy the fat of the land. You are also directed to tell them, do this, take some carts from Egypt for your children and your wives, and get your father to come. Never mind about your belongings, because the best of Egypt will be yours. So the sons of Israel did this. Joseph gave them carts, as Pharaoh had commanded, and also he gave them provisions for their journey. To each of them he gave new clothing, but to Benjamin he gave 300 shekels of silver and 5 sets of clothes. And this was what he sent to his father: 10 donkeys loaded with the best things of Egypt, and 10 female donkeys loaded with grain and bread and other provisions for his journey. Then he sent his brothers away, and they were leaving. He said to them, Don't quarrel on your way. So they went up out of Egypt and came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan. They told him, Joseph is still alive. In fact, he is ruler of all Egypt. Jacob was stunned. He did not believe them. But when they told him everything Joseph had said to them, and when he saw the carts Joseph had sent to carry him back, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. And Israel said, I'm convinced my son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. Now for the deep dive commentary. This chapter opens with a moment so emotionally charged, so deeply human that the entire tone of Joseph's story shifts. Joseph, now second in command in Egypt, finally reveals his identity to the very brothers who betrayed him. The build-up has been intense: tests, hidden silver, planted cups, and it all comes to a head not with revenge, but with weeping. The Hebrew word used here for weeping is baka, and it appears twice in the opening verses. First, when Joseph could no longer control himself in verse 1, and again when he weeps loudly as he embraces Benjamin in verse 14. This isn't a restrained royal shedding of a tear. This is a gut-level, soul-bursting release. In ancient Near Eastern culture, such loud expressions of grief or joy were common in familial settings, but considered deeply vulnerable in public, especially from someone in Joseph's position. His sobs were so loud that they reached Pharaoh's house. This detail is important. It shows that Joseph didn't just forgive in private. His mercy became part of Egypt's royal awareness. Reconciliation made noise. When Joseph says, "I am Joseph, is my father still alive?" in verse 3, the Hebrew structure here includes the phrase Hadat Ava Hai, literally, is my father still living? It reflects not just curiosity, but a longing that's been buried beneath years of silence. This moment is raw and real. His power disappears, and the son, the brother, the once abandoned child emerges. But the true theological weight of this chapter comes in verses 4 through 8. Joseph says something profound. "It was not you who sent me here, but God." This is the heart of the chapter, and in many ways, the heart of Joseph's entire life narrative. Joseph reframes the betrayal not as meaningless suffering, but as a part of God's providential design. He repeats it 3 times in these verses. God sent me before you to preserve life in verse 5. God sent me before you to preserve you a remnant, verse 7. And it was not you, but God in verse 8. In Hebrew, the phrase Elohim shalachanti is the anchor. God sent me. This is Joseph's theology of suffering. That God can work through betrayal, through famine, through the most broken parts of the human stories to bring about something redemptive. Historically, this reflects a larger theme in Hebrew thought. God is sovereign, author of events, even when humans act out of sin or malice. Unlike some surrounding ancient Near Eastern cultures where the gods were petty or reactionary, Israel's God was portrayed as sovereign, even over human choices. Joseph's language here anticipates later ideas in biblical theology, especially Paul's reflection in Romans 8:28. God works all things together for good. Another key theological motif here is the concept of remnant preservation. When Joseph says God sent him to preserve for you a remnant on earth, in verse 7, the Hebrew word sharit is important. This term becomes a major prophetic theme in later in Scripture. Especially in Isaiah and in Jeremiah, it refers to the faithful few who survive judgment and carry on God's promises. In Genesis 45, we're seeing the early shadow of this idea. Despite famine, dysfunction, and betrayal, God is preserving the seed of Abraham. This moment also has political and cultural undertones. Joseph, a Hebrew, now has the authority to resettle his entire family in Egypt, a powerful and agriculturally rich empire. Pharaoh's approval in verse 16 through 18 reflects how highly Joseph was esteemed. Pharaoh says, "The best of all the land to Egypt is yours," in verse 20. From a cultural standpoint, this is shocking. Egypt had clear distinctions between native Egyptians and foreigners, and Hebrews were often looked down upon. That Joseph could override such cultural divisions underscores that the level of divine favor he had and the radical nature of his reconciliation. There's another layer of cultural tension hidden here. The Hebrews, will live in Goshen, an agriculturally fertile region of northeastern Egypt. This was strategic. It kept them close but separate. Egyptian priests and elites disdained shepherds, as we'll see in the next chapter. So this move preserved both Egyptian cultural pride and Hebrew distinctiveness. It foreshadows Israel's eventual enslavement, but at this stage, Goshen represents provision and peace. The symbolic significance of the donkeys loaded with goods and provisions in verses 23 and 24 also reflect covenant generosity. Sitting them back with Egyptian wealth mirrors earlier biblical scenes where the reconciliation includes lavish gifts. Think of Jacob's gifts to Esau. But there's also a tender pastoral touch. Joseph sends his brothers with food and clothing, and he says in verse 24, don't quarrel on your way. In Hebrew it's al terzu barak. Do not be agitated along the road. He knows that their guilt might turn into blame shifting or conflict. Even here, Joseph shepherds their hearts, not just their bodies. So when Jacob hears the news in verse 25 through 28, the Hebrew text says, B'yafag labu. His heart went numb. Some scholars argue this idiom suggests either disbelief or sudden emotional shock. It's not until he sees the wagons Joseph sent that the spirit of their father Jacob revived. The phrase in Hebrew is Vati Ra'ah Ya'ol Ke'ov Avihim, a kind of resurrection of hope. Jacob, who had once said, I will go down to Sheol in mourning, is now spiritually reawakened. His narrative arc completes a circle. The son presumed dead is alive, and the father who lost hope now finds new life. From a theological perspective, this chapter beautifully models the power of reconciliation in covenantal community. Joseph doesn't minimize the past, but he doesn't let it define the future either. His forgiveness is rooted in trust in God's sovereignty, not just in emotional resolution. That's critical. It wasn't just that Joseph felt like forgiving. It's that he saw purpose in the pain. We also see the beginning of Israel's migration to Egypt, which sets the stage for the entire Exodus story. This chapter becomes a hinge point in the broader biblical narrative. The promise to Abraham that his descendants would be a great nation continues, but now in a foreign land. God's providence includes exile, survival, and the eventual call to liberation. Critically, some scholars have pointed out the literary artistry of Genesis 45. The narrative employs chastic structure, a mirror-like pattern common in Hebrew storytelling. For instance, Joseph weeps at the beginning and Joseph revives at the end. Joseph sends provisions and Pharaoh confirms the blessing. These cultural details show us that the biblical author didn't just record events. He carefully shaped them to reflect theological and emotional depth. This chapter is also a rich ground of pastoral application, especially for those wrestling with trauma, betrayal, or long-delayed resolution. Joseph's storytelling tells us that God's timing doesn't always match ours, but his purposes never fall short. It invites us to trust that what feels like silence or suffering may one day become the context for healing and blessing. Genesis 45 isn't just about reunion. It's about what reunion looks like when it's rooted in faith, humility, and a vision bigger than personal justice. It's the kind of reconciliation that sees divine fingerprints all over human scars. And it calls us quietly but boldly to believe that our own broken stories might still become a part of something redemptive too. Thank you for being here with me as we walk through God's Word together. If this chapter stirred something in you, or you saw something that I didn't mention, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment and let's keep the conversation going. And it's such a gift to study this with you day by day, chapter by chapter. Until next time, maybe you feel God's nearness. May His truth guide you, and may His love pervade you. Thank you so much for being with me, and we will see you tomorrow.